Okay, so we begin recording. So I know many of you, but for those that I don't, there are a couple of names I don't recognise. I'm Matt Alford. I'm Senior Lecturer Alliance Manchester Business School at the University of Manchester. And I want to say a really warm welcome to Network O's second webinar in our GBC Conversations 2023 webinar series, where, as you know, I think we're going to discuss a book by Jean Chalaby, Television in the Streaming Era, The Global Shift. We'll get to it much more momentarily, but it gives a really fascinating insight into transformations in the TV industry under both, and this case is well made in the book, globalizing forces and digital technologies, with important implications for GVC theory that we'll get into much more in a bit. Really brief background, if that's all right. I will be brief. So this webinar series builds on previous ones we've done in 2021 and 22. And what the 2023 webinars try and do, and that's exactly what we're going to try and do today, is kind of focus on recently published GBC related special issues, or in this case, a book, giving an overview of key insights from the work, through discussion with authors, editors, and in this case, some discussants. So that's what the 2023 webinars are what we're aiming to do. I'm sure you're all aware, or at least I know 70 or 8% of you will be aware based on the people who are here. But just as a brief reminder, or to say that the Network O Global Value Chains is one of a number of networks comprising Society for the Advancement of Socio-Economics, or SASE. Network O is coordinated by myself, Rory Horner, who's with us today, Jen Baer from the University of Virginia, and Cornelia Staritz from the University of Vienna can't be with us, but they send their apologies. They're the other network coordinators. As another quick reminder, the SASE 2023 conference is taking place in Rio from July the 20th to the 22nd. Network O will be really well represented there. We've had a lot of really interesting submissions. I won't get into that now. With that spiel out of the way, my apologies for that, just to provide some background and context to the webinar and why we're all here. We're delighted to have the author of the book, Jean, with us today. It's based at the School of Policy and Global Affairs, the Department of Sociology and Criminology at City University London, along with our excellent discussants, Jennifer Johns, from the University of Bristol Business School, and Dev Nathan, who's a visiting scholar at the New School for Social Research, New York, and visiting professor at the Institute for Human Development in Delhi. So Jennifer and Dev are experts in this field. We're really grateful they accepted our invitation, particularly given the busy schedules that we're all subject to. It's also worth mentioning briefly, Dev, if you don't mind me doing so, that Dev's part of the editorial board for the Development Trajectories and Global Value Chains Cambridge University Press book series. I know a number of the other editors are here as well today, of which Jean's book is one of a number of interesting GBC related books in that series as well. So before we get stuck in, one final really big thanks to Jean, Jennifer, and Dev for being here. I know I've said it to them already, but we're really grateful for them to be here today. A brief note now, brief mention of the structure of the session, just so you're aware of what we're going to do and what's going on. Jean is going to give an overview of his book for around 20 minutes. Then we'll have Jennifer's responses for around 10 minutes or so, and then Dev's responses for around 10 minutes or so to Jean's commentary and the book itself. Then Jean will reply, I'll ask him if he wants to briefly respond with some reflections to Jennifer and Dev's comments, and then we'll open up for more general discussion, if that all sounds okay. I think that's more than enough from me for now. I'll be fairly strict on time, but I'm not going to be completely too much. So I'll try and give Jean, Jennifer, and Dev the space they need. Okay, so Jean, over to you. Do you have slides you would like to use, Jean, or?
Oh, I'm afraid Welcome all. Thank you, Matt, for this introduction. And no, I'm just reading something. Sorry, very old school, but
I didn't think you would. I just wanted to check, and I made you a co-host in a panic just in case you did. But there you go. Over to you. No problem.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you. Welcome all, and thank you to the Network O for inviting me. Special thanks to the Network O team, you, Matt, Jen, Jennifer, Rory, and Cornelia, and Deb. And thank you for the GVC community for publishing my book and help me. All the reviewers really helped me write a much better book than it was initially. So I'm very grateful for this. It's a pleasure and honor to be here. This book explores transformations in the TV industry under the impact of globalizing forces and digital technologies. It investigates the making of a digital value chain and the distinct value-adding segments which form a new video ecosystem. The book provides a full account of the industry's global shift from the development of transnational TV networks in the 1980s to the formation of a television GVC and emergence of tech giants and streaming platforms. Takes a deep dive into the infrastructure, communication satellites, subsea cable networks, data centers, and technology, cloud computing, streaming software underpinning this system. The television value chain includes 3 segments on the content production side and 3 segments in media delivery. The first include facilities like TV studios, content production itself, and distribution. On the media delivery side, there is publication, distribution, and reception. Each segment is a mini industry in its own right, and suppliers specialize in one segment. There is a certain amount of vertical integration as lead firms target suppliers for acquisition, but that does not offset the vertical specialization that characterize the TV industry in the streaming era. Dominant model for lead firms is outsourcing, as they need to deliver a clear narrative to investors and focus on what they do best, which is content. Netflix is one example among many. The platform commissions all its content to film and TV producers, and when it says it acts as producer, it means it pays for the totality of the content rights in all the territories and in perpetuity. On the media delivery side, while Netflix consumes a significant percentage of the available internet bandwidth, it doesn't operate a single data center. For delivery, it uses the services of cloud operators, notably AWS, Amazon Web Services. It was not long ago that television was dominated by vertically integrated and nation-centric broadcasters. They were connected, but not interdependent. Outsourcing created a web of suppliers that vertically specialize and operate on a worldwide basis. This GVC underpins a global production system that consists of a transnational network of interdependent firms. Television operates as a global value chain, an evolution that is historically significant and help us understand how the industry is evolving. Let's take the example of the astonishing pace of change or progress we can all observe. The history of streaming and streaming technology, which I go through in my book, is barely 20 years old. Interestingly, the technology was developed with classrooms in mind, not entertainment, but that's another story. 15 years ago, most platforms were in their infancy and many had yet to launch. Fast forward to the present, streaming platforms dominate ratings in many markets. In the UK, young people between 16 and 34 spend far more time on YouTube and Netflix than on any local broadcaster, public or otherwise. The pace of progress is astonishing, which the GVC framework can explain: massive modularity in media delivery and vertical specializations throughout the chain. Suppliers specialize in what they do best and do so at international level. When they innovate for everybody. The transition from broadcasting to streaming is significant. Streaming uses internet-based infrastructure and technology to distribute content, thereby completely shifting distribution processes. These new processes are significantly changing the scope and character of the TV industry. In the past, television used its own tech and infrastructure, and broadcasters were as much engineering companies as content firms. Broadcasting was like the Galapagos Islands, operating its very own little ecosystem. Today, streamers and broadcasters share the tech and infrastructure of the digital world, and tech giants will determine the future of video as much as any broadcaster. While the point of equilibrium of broadcasting was national, it is global for streaming. All monetization and amortization models are international, both on the content and media delivery sides. No one invests hundreds of millions of dollars in a single TV series just to show it in a single market. The cloud is global by nature, and only targeted political measures can stop it in its track. That's why China and a few other countries operate at the margins of the global TV industry. Thinking and operating nationally is impossible and requires robust legal protection to do so. Broadcasting was a national industry that slowly internationalized. Streaming is a global industry that is progressively localizing. From a media and communication perspective, this book innovates because it is the first to take the global TV industry as the unit of analysis. Media and communication scholars have traditionally focused on lead firms, such as Disney, giving them a partial view of the industry. I demonstrate how television went through a process of transformation that is the formation of a GVC. The challenge was to analyze certain aspects of the transition from broadcasting to streaming. Throughout the study, I observed the GVC canon scrupulously, but the digitization of the TV industry would necessitate a degree of theoretical innovation. An intervention is needed in order to understand how globalization and digitization entwine. A particularly salient aspect of digitization is the emergence of platforms. Whilst I use the platform literature in my book, I found it problematic in several aspects. I've read everything that is to read on platforms, and my conclusion is that this literature cannot be integrated into the GVC framework. The issue is that the epistemological standpoint of the former is entirely different from the latter. The platform literature is too theoretical in character, and its concepts are shaped on a too narrow empirical corpus. It is too top-down, meaning that it focuses on platform architects, such as Apple and Google, and fails to conceptualize the power relations between architects and their complementers. The platform literature is also managerial in tone, and while it waxes lyrical on the handful of platforms that have succeeded, it fails to say a word on the hundreds that have failed. Finally, it is tech-centric, and I found the applicability of its ideal types questionable at times. A suggestion is that the GVC community may want to look at platforms and reconceptualize them from a GVC perspective. The key distinction between a supplier and platform complementer is that the latter has access to the market and consumers. Indeed, customers purchase their own app on Apple Store or Google Play. It's true that capital flows differ from between a JVC and a platform. Platforms are two-sided markets, bringing together, in the case of the PlayStation, for instance, game publishers and gamers. But there are also similarities between platforms and JVCs. And in a certain sense, complementers are suppliers. They must abide by the rules of the platform architect, who takes a large slice of the revenue. Platforms are governed by modularity, as some JVCs. If I were to study platforms from a JVC perspective, I would focus on complementers rather than architects, and look at platforms bottom-up rather than top-down. The relations between complementers and platforms architects in terms of rewards and risk distribution deserve more attention. So, analyzing platforms from a JVC perspective requires that they are contextualized in the industries in which they operate. I found the applicability of the platform literature somewhat limited because it tends to analyze platforms as a phenomenon on its own right. For instance, Netflix may be a platform in the engineering sense of the term, but not from a commercial or industrial perspective. Netflix suppliers have access to no market, and as the platform tend to acquire all rights, the film and TV producers can't even exploit their own intellectual property and use it to build their asset base. Netflix is a classic lead firm that operates in a classic JVC configuration, even though it distributes its content via a platform. The platform literature was most useful to analyze platforms that rely on user-generated content, chiefly YouTube. In this case, indeed, there is an ecosystem with millions of content providers that participate in the advertising markets. This being said, not everything is new in the shining wall of platforms. Much emphasis is made about the two-sided markets of platforms, but it's nothing new in the world of media and communication. The 17th century newspaper that brought together readers and advertisers was as much a platform as the Xbox or Google Play. The overall relationship between JVCs and digital industries need to be thought through to a bit more. Television is more than a JVC. As we've seen, it includes platforms and ecosystems. Following Tim Sturgeon, the TV industry can be defined as an ecosystem of ecosystems that crisscross multiple production networks, platforms, and ecosystems. From a JVC perspective, the concept of ecosystem is the most promising, as recently demonstrated by Tim in his article, Massive Modularity, Understanding Industry Organization in the Digital Age. As Tim writes, JVCs are embodied in what he calls massive modular systems, but the question is how, and what is the role of JVCs in these systems? Our first step, I like to distinguish between three types of ecosystems. There is the platform ecosystem, such as YouTube, that includes an architect and multiple complementers. Then there is the enterprise ecosystem, such as those built by Amazon, Apple, or Google. Google, for instance, has 9 products with more than 1 billion users, which are often intertwined. Finally, there is the industry ecosystem, which includes multiple production networks, platforms, and enterprise ecosystems in the sense that Tim describes. What are the differences between the JVC and an industry ecosystem? And what are the role of JVCs in the latter? These are the questions I'm thinking about now. The JVC community has made great contribution in our knowledge of understanding of economic globalization on the world system, as in Immanuel Wallerstein called it. But theoretical adaptation is probably needed in order to understand globalization in the digital age. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jean, for that really insightful overview. I'm just going to change the view. And for not just discussing the book itself. Of course, you touched on key aspects in the book, but really orienting, steering the conversation, the discussion towards the implications for GVC theory. So thanks a lot for that overview. I'm going to now.
I talked about what I struggle most. That's what I did.
I appreciate the honesty, and it was very interesting. I mean, it raises a lot of really important and interesting general questions. So thanks very much. As per our schedule, we're doing very well for time. So I'm now going to hand over to Jennifer Johns for her commentary and discussion of Jean's book. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Jean. I was also very conscious that I wasn't doing a book review. I tended to sit down and think I'm going to read from the start right through to the end. And I reflected on that a bit about the purpose of today and thinking that we don't actually use academic books like that. Rarely do we start at the beginning and work through. So that gave me cause to really look at the contents page and give me a sense of what I thought I was going to pick most out of the book and related to GVCs. Also realizing my own background, which was very much focusing on production in particular locations and mapping the value chain really much in the agglomeration of creative industries, video games and TV. So I feel like I already know quite a lot about production, and I was then very encouraged to see that the book is about things that we need to pay more attention to, particularly in global value chains, moving beyond just this production perspective and looking at distribution. So I was very aware of the contemporary issues around logistics in manufacturing, but also around services and how we get things to the people who are going to use them. So that's very much filling one of these very needed gaps in terms of distribution. I wanted to kind of highlight some things I did like very much about the book and relate those to things I think we need to think about more in relation to global value chains. I was very pleased that the book concentrates very much on change dynamics. And I was aware of this kind of dynamism and change within global value chains and industries and how they intersect. It's not static at all. And you're very good at describing where we're coming from in the TV industry and where we might be heading. There's talk about the firms, mergers and acquisitions. And I very much appreciated that, very grounded and coming from a business school, perhaps valuing some of that more in-depth discussion around particular firms and what was happening to those firms and those broader dynamics around the industry, understanding it as an industry. So there I see the greater scope for interdisciplinary approaches that global value chains approach really does facilitate. The book is very focused on the TV industry, but it connects into lots of conversations that I know those of us who are interested in GVCs are having around digitalization. Some of us saw each other in Berlin last year, and conversations there was very much around digitalization and platforms. I actually am doing less in relation to platforms and more on digital tools to in terms of distributed manufacturing. So I'm kind of going the other way in this. I very much feel like I wish I'd written your book, Jean, actually, because the things I've been thinking about in terms of the bigger industry perspectives around the firms and where they're heading and around distribution. One question I actually ask my students quite often is, when we use GVC approach, do we need to distinguish between manufacturing and services? And do they need a different approach? And your book, I think, taught me that you're using essentially the GVC mechanism, and it can cover both services and manufacturing in the same way. And some of the languages you've just used, in fact, when you're talking about your book about, a transnational network of interdependent firms, and that the concept can actually cover both these things without having to be particular and peculiar. Because often creative industries are set up as being peculiar and particular around creativity, around having different dynamics in them. And actually, I think what I took away from your book and your approach is that that's not necessarily the case, and we can understand them from an industrial systems perspective. yeah, I mentioned about change dynamics, these contemporary topics around digitalization and the rise of platforms. That's reminded me of the recent Global Networks special issue around GVCs and digitalization. And I think that you connect into several of the important issues that are raised in that special issue. I think perhaps you're a geographer in disguise, in the sense that you seem to be very conscious of the spatialities of what you're seeing in the TV industry. And yours is one of the first contributions I've seen really trying to get to grips with these shifts, because much of my work is at the local level and understanding national dynamics. And this is that contribution to look towards the transnational. Although a lot of the book is by necessity focused on perhaps advanced economies, although there is mention of places like Bollywood. I very much like your return and emphasis on vertical disintegration. Where I started my academic career was reading the work of Susan Christopherson, for example, and that very much informed my PhD, and a reminder that as we take the GVC approach forward, there is still lots of work that we can draw on again, and of course that work is particularly important around specialization and vertical disintegration. I'm not going to talk too much around platforms, because I think I'm not best placed to. I was really focusing on understanding the TV industry. And I did want to highlight how I think it would be a very useful teaching tool. I feel often when I teach about GVCs, I'm teaching about particular types of industry like automotive, which several of us have worked on. This is a welcome addition, I think, to engage students in the GVC approach, to talk about things like Who Wants to Be a Millionaire and Love Island, and really useful ways to connect them in with your very rich and detailed data. It does remind me again, as we use a GVC approach, really quite the range of data we need to support this methodological approach that we're using in terms of understanding the firms. And you've clearly done a lot of work on these firms, a lot of quantitative data analysis, I think, as well as understanding the qualitative. I was particularly interested in the power relations, which is something that you talk about in terms of understanding the interactions. For me, one of the key messages, which I wholeheartedly agree with, is understanding digitalization and GVCs, but differentiating the impacts that they have at different parts of the value chain, and understanding the interactions between those parts of the value chain and those differential impacts. And differentiating between different types of technologies. And your chapters very clearly spell out the different technologies that are driving this digitalization. And you have many typologies, and I'm a big fan of typologies, but mapping out different types of firms and what their characteristics are and how they are evolving the global value chains. One thing I would like to posit maybe as a discussion point later is, it's very clear that you look at this GVC and TV industry very much within the conventional sense. And I was thinking about some of the dark sides, and I was reminded of a lot of earlier work on music and the work, for example, of Andrew Lation around the illegalities of some of this streaming and sharing, and how that drove evolution of the music industry. And I am aware that there are lots of illegal ways to get hold of some of these TV programs. So that's maybe just a point of how we kind of uncover some of the darkness of global value chains. I think I've covered everything I needed to cover, so I think I'm bang on time. So I'll just say thanks very much, John, for the contribution.
And thanks to you, for the really excellent commentary on Jean's book. Indeed, you're absolutely spot on, right on point with time. And I really like how your reflections, as you say, are oriented towards your own research and your own the excellent work you've done on digitization in relation to global value chains, not just looking at platforms, but other aspects of digitization and that nexus between digital processes and global value chains, which I think, as you say, Jean's book really covers, not just the platform GVC nexus. So thanks a lot for those great observations. It's a lot of food for thought for the general Q&A that's upcoming.
Yeah, I was hoping to think a little bit more about it, But thank you very much, Jennifer, for reading the book, for taking into account this feedback. I think I have to absorb it. Thank you for you. I think you've been very generous when you read the book. Yeah, certainly changed. I mean, what television was very protected a few decades ago, it pivoted to culture, to national culture. There's this debate going on for decades. And I think it's a significant shift that will really will have and has a cultural impact. That's for sure. But I have to say that most of the things you mentioned, including digitization and GVCs, I have to be honest, I struggle with it. So I wanted to have something that was theoretically coherent. And really, I kind of was building the fortress around the GVC paradigm without looking too much at platform theory. I know that platform literature is all queried now, is quite big. I think maybe we will need to have a conversation with them. I think our epistemological standpoint is very, very different. I think for me, GVC has roots in social sciences. You know, I first read Fernand Braudel, then I read Immanuel Wallerstein, and then I read Gary Gareffi in this order. So it's very traditional the way I read GVCs, but for me it has these roots. And for the dark side, it's very interesting. So I'm afraid the darkest sides of streaming is pornography. It's huge. And I should absolutely do not mention it in my book, but some estimates are absolutely astonishing, and it's there. So yeah, that it'd be interesting to look at this from a GVC perspective. Something I don't talk at all in my book. The dark side as well is labor. The screenwriters are currently on strike in Hollywood for a reason of revenue distribution, and labor in streaming is very unequally rewarded. It's almost, I spoke to a few YouTubers, and although they spend a lot of time and energy and talent on the channels, it's almost impossible, if not completely impossible, to make a living out of streaming. It's very difficult. So all this board of streamers, whether are gamers on Twitch, the YouTube, that's the dark side of streaming. I think it's labor. And the days where we're all working in a public service company like the BBC, you had your 9-to-5 job with your pension, you paid holidays, that's completely gone. So I think inequalities in general, it would be the dark side of streaming. And you have few platforms making billions. I think YouTube has exceed $30 billion in advertising revenue every year. And on the back of millions of streamers who don't really make a living out of this. In fact, if you look at YouTubers, some with successful channels, they always open the channel saying that, oh yeah, buy me a coffee. I mean, it's streaming. I think the dark side of streaming is the inequalities.
Thanks a lot, John. I mean, that's some really great reflections on Jennifer's comments. I also thought Jennifer's comments about the illegality and the dark side was fascinating. And I also had some questions maybe for you down the line about labor, and you've touched on both of those issues. So thanks a lot for that. I'm sure there are others in the room that would have questions relating to those topics. For now, we're very, very pleased to welcome Dev back after some technical hiccups. So without further ado, I'll just hand over straight to Dev for your comments.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Sorry about that breakdown. But anyway, as I said, we would like to congratulate Jean for the book. And certainly personally, it helped me reading it. It made a complex value chain somewhat understandable. It still remains quite complex. But I have two main comments with regard to the analysis in the book. One is on the question of value addition, which is used by Jean and by many of our colleagues in the global value chain analysis literature. And I would like to raise the question, is value addition the correct concept or value capture? And what is the difference between the two? And secondly, the book brings about a very interesting point with regard to a form of countervailing power within the global value chain. And I'd like to bring that forward. So the first point is this value addition or value capture. Now, the television GVC, like any other product, is produced and delivered by numerous actors or suppliers, including aggregators of different kinds. Now, in neoclassical economic analysis, what you get is what you added. So whatever the profit a firm gets is what it added, plus, of course, whatever inputs it also put in. But this kind of, either you assume that there's a perfectly competitive market, so market prices are equal to values in a sense, or you just ignore the power relations that actually exist in the market. So the power relations, what are they over here? They are the power relations of monopoly, which we are all very familiar with. And I think there's another power relation which we are less familiar with, and that is monopsony, which is a concept which was first put forward by Joan Robinson in 1933 in her book. Now, how do we come to this? First of all, we have to see, is there something we can call a cost of production? Therefore, I here use the notion which is there in Marx and Keynes, that there is a cost of production. The cost of production is the price of inputs plus the normal or the average, or we may call competitive profit. So that becomes the cost of production. Now, what does the monopoly allow the firm to do? It allows the firm to increase the price beyond its cost of production, therefore earning a profit, which can often be well above the competitive profit which prevails in that economy. Therefore, it raises it raises the profit much above it. For instance, the lead firms that we all deal with have profits which go from 45 to 60% as the gross margin. These are very, very high. Now, on the other side, you have the suppliers whose profits, for instance, garment suppliers' profits, gross profit margins, if I put it that way, don't exceed 8 to 10%. They may sometimes go to 11 or 12, but that's about it. So the monopoly allows the lead firm to a monopoly, often backed by intellectual property rights of various kinds, allows the lead firm to set a price above what would be a competitive price. On the other side, the monopoly is also a monopsony, again, as Joan Robinson clearly pointed out. Well, if you have only one producer of a commodity, then you have only one buyer of its inputs. So if you have only 5 lead firms, Disney and 4 or 5 of the other big streamers, like, of course, Netflix among them, then you have only 5 buyers of the various inputs that make up that product and its distribution. So what does that monopsony allow? It allows, on the other side, the inelastic supply means that of the suppliers means that the monopsony is able to push prices below the cost of production. So, of course, you'd ask how you manage if you push it down below the cost of production. The point is there is a kind of subsidy that is at play over here, and this subsidy may be extracted from labor, it may be extracted from the environment. Now, these subsidies may be extracted at the point of production, but the monopsony character of a global value chain, where there are few buyers and many suppliers, allows the lead firms to transfer, and therefore I use the term value capture, to capture the excess due to the inelastic supply side. Now, this, I think, is why I would strongly argue, again, since many of our colleagues in the GVC are here, that we need to go from the idea of the value addition to talk about value capture. And that brings in both the monopoly and the monopsony side into the analysis. That is one main point. The second comment, I take it from the analysis that Jean has put forward. I like very much the point he makes. He didn't use exactly this term, but there are 2 sets of suppliers in Jean's analysis of the streaming service. One, you have content producers. They are suppliers of one type. And then you have the tech service companies who supply the infrastructure, the cloud computing essential to streaming. Now, in the content producers, you have a highly competitive market. Well, there'll be a few well-known brands or well-known, if you're Beyonce, etc., you can get a price much above the cost of production. But as such, overall, the content production side is a very competitive market, made more competitive by the globalization which is there. Within that, you'll get some who are able to get a bit more. But on the other side, you have the tech suppliers, which, as Jean points out, are essential to streaming. Now, there are only a handful of these tech companies which supply this cloud computing service. Jean lists them: Amazon, Microsoft, Google, IBM, and then also Alibaba, Baidu, Facebook, and Tencent. Now, these are the handful of suppliers of the cloud computing service that is essential for the globalization of the streaming that we now see, and they face a handful of the lead firms. So what we are having here is a kind of balance, a countervailing power against the buyer monopsony, which is the supplier monopoly, which is in what we may call in other conditions, it has been called the choke point technologies or the choke point services. For instance, there's only one company in Japan that produces 90 to 95% of all the little motors which run your side view mirrors in the automobiles. There's only one company. So obviously it has a choke point technology. There are only 5 firms that produce, that supply the cloud computing services. So they have a choke point supply, which they are able to utilize to get a much higher share of the revenue and a higher profit. I didn't see that, but yes, they do get a higher share because you cannot do any streaming without going to one or the other of these high-tech suppliers. So I would like to therefore point out that there is a role for a manner in which a countervailing power, there can be other ways in which countervailing power comes up. For instance, there may be an association of suppliers, but that's very easy to break up because of competition among them. But a key way in which it has happened so far is through a few suppliers or a single supplier of a choke point service or a choke point technology. So I would just put these 2 points for discussion. One is that we need to talk not of value addition, but of value capture. And secondly, the role of choke point technologies in allowing a kind of countervailing power in the monopoly situation of global value chains. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dev, for that really succinct commentary that raised different issues to Jennifer, but fascinating nonetheless, issues around that GBC scholars have been grappling with, as you say, over time, issues of value capture, power asymmetry in value chains, where power is held, and what can be done to challenge that. So really fascinating issues. As planned, I will hand over to Jean for your reflections on Dev, and indeed Jennifer. I know you were slightly rushed earlier in a sense, but we got the beginnings of an interesting discussion going. But I'd like to give you the opportunity, Jean, to reflect, reply, comment on our excellent discussants just then.
Yes, thank you very much, Dev. That was very interesting. I'm going to say 3 things. First, about the other industries, I've learned a lot from the automotive industry, the apparel industry from Gary, and the tech industry from Tim. I found the industry-specific studies are very interesting. I find them much more contextualized. Things that's the problem I have with the platform literature. It become like platform capitalism, where it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't work like this. So I really learn a lot from other industries, because I know Jennifer, both you and Jennifer have mentioned the automotive industry. And when I say this in media and communication circles, they scream blue murder because they think television is completely different. I don't think so. For the types of supplier, I think you're absolutely right. I think what I found, I struggle a little bit with this, but the content suppliers, collectively, it's industry captive. If you're a film and TV producer, all you can do is supply the TV industry. And some of them have tried YouTube channels. I don't think that's very successful. So collectively, yeah, you're captive of the television industry, and there's not much else you can do. And you really not, the power relation is really in favor of the lead firm. That's for sure. And you see this in the valuation of film and TV producers. Usually they're not worth that much money, and compared to the valuation of people like Netflix. And then you're absolutely right to outline, on the other side, in media delivery, we're dealing with cloud suppliers and tech giants who are global in their own right, and they have far better position than the film and TV producers, because they are multi-sectoral. I read a lot of articles on multi-sectoral suppliers, and then much better position. Obviously, cloud producers are. I've done some interviews at Amazon AWS. I think they got 5,000 clients, and in Europe at least, probably more. And yes, they are in a power position. Regarding value capture and value addition and monopoly, yeah, I agree that I have to think a little bit more about the distinction between value addition and value capture. But it's true that streaming makes value capture more unequal than in broadcasting. Simply the way the industry is structured and globally structured. But we're going towards a more monopoly in streaming. There's very few. You need a content budget of at least $10 billion to survive in streaming globally. People like HBO Max, Apple TV Plus, Netflix, Amazon Prime Video, they invest at least, I would say, a bit less, sometimes more than $10 billion. And that's a game very few people can play. You need a huge access to capital, and you need to be able to borrow a lot of money to invest and take risk in content. So I think the issues you highlight them are absolutely relevant to television, and the rise of monopoly in television. I hope I answered some of the questions, but yeah, I have to. Yeah.
No, thank you very much, Sean. No, that was a really useful reply, and I think it was useful to give you that space to reply to Jennifer and Dev's comments. So I would like to ask the wider audience now, and I'm going to remember to actually stop recording now.